warning against gospel declaration void of a life that does not adorn the message being proclaimed. But if you take the quote at face value, it's actually incomplete and a little bit of a misunderstanding of how gospel proclamation works. I know that even in quoting it, some of you preachers and missiologists in here were ready to stand up and start quoting Paul, who asked the rhetorical question, how will they hear without a preacher, right? The reality is the gospel requires us to use words to communicate it. In his sovereignty, God has chosen to use the language of words to communicate the explicit truths of the gospel. And that is true. However, even the most convicted among us would also agree that God's beauty and his goodness can be communicated and adorned in many other ways besides simply speaking with words. The scriptures themselves remind us that the heavens declare the majesty and the glory of God. Jesus often used vivid stories and parables to illustrate timeless kingdom truths to his hearers. So I would say that gospel proclamation is never less than the spoken word, but it often can be so much more. This afternoon during this session, we have the privilege of learning about one whose life and work did adorn the gospel, a black quilt maker from the 19th century named Harriet Powers. Though she was born a slave, this incredible woman learned how to study and read the Bible at a young age and found ways to speak truths from the scriptures using art as a method of communication. And though she is dead, her life still speaks to us, primarily through the survival of two different quilts she made. Quilts which she was quoted as saying her aim in making them was to, quote, preach the gospel in patchwork. A woman deeply committed to Jesus and his good news, Miss Powers used her gifts to leave an enduring legacy of gospel proclamation, and it is a legacy that still inspires today, and we have the privilege of learning about her. So good morning again to everyone, or afternoon, I guess. Maybe I wrote this when it was the morning, but good afternoon to everyone in attendance at this year's Black History is Church History Conference. As Amos said, my name is Joel. I am someone who's been captured by the good news of Jesus and the proclamation of the gospel. It's transformed my life, and so my heart's desire is to see other people come into contact with that same good news. I'm a husband of almost 15 years to my wife, Christy. We have 4 kids together, and as Amos said, I'm a member at New Eden Church over in Decatur, and I also have the joy of serving as an elder and pastor for preaching there as well. I'm honored to be a part of this conference again this year. It's one of the joys of my year as we look forward to it every year, not only as a speaker, because I'm challenged to learn a lot in that, but also as a participant. I love being able to come and just receive and learn and be transformed, not just through the learning of facts, right, and some exchange of information, but transformation that happens as we hear truth proclaimed and the Spirit causes it to take root in our hearts. And so thank you to Worthy Redeemer Church, Pastor Wade, and all of you volunteers that make this possible, and the other speakers as well for their time and efforts in their proclamation of truth this morning. So like I said, during this session, we're looking at the life of Harriet Powers. She was a wife, mother of 9 children, slave, quilt maker, and most importantly, disciple of Jesus. Fun little fact, put the stamps on the screen there. Actually, this morning at 11 a.m., the U.S. Postal Service held a commissioning ceremony in Washington, D.C., and released these stamps of Harriet Powers, some of her works of art. So you can actually now go buy these stamps. And I think it's pretty cool that this former slave had no idea that her quilt making of biblical stories would still be proclaiming truth on letters all around the world in 2026. So that's a fun little tidbit that I found out about. So you can go purchase those now. Harriet Powers was born as a slave near Athens, Georgia, so not too far from here, in 1837. We don't know a whole lot about her early life. Most of what we do know comes from a letter that Miss Powers wrote at around 58 years old. Someone had asked her to kind of share her own biography, and she recounts her early days. This is what she says. The life of Harriet Powers, born in Madison County, 8 miles from Athens on the Elberton Road in the year October 29th, 1837. I commenced to learn at 11 years old, and the white children learned me by sound on a poplar leaf. On Sundays after that, I done my own studying. There's different censuses later in her life that have conflicting records of her literacy, as is common for slaves and black men and women in this era. But all sources indicate that she learned to read and write at a very early age. We even have that here in her own record. Her letter will go on to inform us that she was married in 1855 around the age of 18 to a man named Armstead Powers. Don't know a whole lot about her kids. We do know that at the time of her writing this kind of biographical letter, which she would have been around 58, only 3 of her 9 children were still alive. The rest had passed. And so there is no doubt this woman, born as a slave in Georgia, surviving at least 6 of her children, had faced tremendous hardship. And as you look at her quilts, the stories that she tells through her artwork is no surprise, as many of them include themes of suffering and the acknowledgement of great evil and betrayal. We do know that somewhere along the line, Harriet began using her skills as a seamstress to make quilts. She recounts making a quilt in 1872. She would have been around the age of 35, comprised of 4,050 diamond-shaped stitches. So I'm not a quilt maker, but from my understanding, that's no small task. Do we have any quilt makers in here? Yeah? No? Okay, cool. I don't have to act like I know what I'm talking about. Or I can, and you won't even know. So, but it's no small task from my understanding. Both of her surviving quilts, which we have 2 of, and most likely her others as well, were deeply rooted in the biblical narrative. They were telling the story of the scriptures in ways that could be understood by those of any age or literacy level. She cared a lot about learning the scriptures. This is what she says in this letter. She says, in 1882, I became a member of Mount Zion Baptist Church. Then I visited Sunday school and read the Bible more than ever. Then I composed a quilt of the Lord's Supper from the New Testament, 2,500 diamonds. Again, just talking about the scope of the quilt. It was very obvious that this woman was steeped in the scriptures and the gospel story, and it came through in the art she created. There was a woman named Jenny Smith. She was a white woman who herself taught art at Lucy Cobb Institute in Athens, Georgia. She would later purchase one of Miss Powers' quilts, and she would document her thoughts about it. And this is what she says about Harriet's biblical literacy. She says, Harriet has portrayed several scenes from the Bible and shows that she is perfectly familiar with its teachings. Most historians believe that Harriet Powers weaved at least 5 different quilts in her lifetime, maybe even more. Of those, we know of 2 that survived and are still in existence today. One, known as the Bible quilt, is housed at the Smithsonian Museum, and the other, which is known as the pictorial quilt, is housed at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Here's a picture of the Bible quilt that she made. I think this is probably the one I'm most intrigued by. As you can tell, these weren't just quilts where you put together 12 t-shirts on a blanket to save some memories, all right? No shade to anyone in here who's done that. That's way more than I could ever do. But you see that her works were very detailed and intricate, and that's without the modern tools that many quilters today have at their disposal. Those of you, if you did have experience with quilt making, you would appreciate the work and the attention to detail. And I encourage you to go look at this later, and you'll see the stitching and the intricate detail that it took to make this kind of art. After the Civil War and emancipation, Harriet and her family moved to Athens, Georgia, not where she was born, not far from there. And she was able to put this quilt on display at a fair there in 1886. And this is where it caught the attention of the woman, Jenny Smith, that I mentioned earlier, this other artist. Miss Smith would have been around 24 years old at this time that she first saw the quilt. And again, as an artist, it caught her eye, especially she would comment later on the vividness of the colors and the detail of the work. And she, being an artist herself, documents her first encounter with the art and how she eventually came into its possession. This is what she documents about it. She says, in one corner there hung a quilt which captured my eye, and after much difficulty I found the owner, a Negro woman who lived in the country on a little farm whereon she and her husband make a respectable living. The pictures on the quilt were biblical, and I was fascinated. I offered to buy it, but it was not for sale at any price. After 4 years, Harriet sent me word that I could buy it if I wanted it. Alas, my finances were at a low ebb, and I could not purchase. Last year, which would have been 1891, I sent her word that I would buy it if she still wanted to dispose of it. And she arrived one afternoon in front of my door in an ox cart with the precious burden in her lap, encased in a clean flour sack. And Jenny Smith goes on to recount how she purchased the quilt for $5, which would be about $175 in today's currency. Later in Jenny's documentation about the quilt, she goes on to describe it as best she can while acknowledging that words really won't do it justice. This is what she says. I regret exceedingly that it is impossible to describe the gorgeous coloring of the work. The groundwork is watermelon pink with green bars to frame each scene, and the figures are in a great variety of hues, but all word painting would sound pale and faded compared with the original. Jenny would come into possession of it and go on to display the quilt at a variety of fairs and shows down through the years. It was most likely seen by the likes of Booker T. Washington, President Grover Cleveland, and many others as they visited these festivals. And as I mentioned, Harriet was not only literate in the English language, but was also fluent and literate in the stories of the scripture as her quilts show us. On the biblical quilt, the Bible quilt, she depicts many scenes from scripture. First, this is the first top left corner, and I'm just going to go through them quickly. You can look at them more later. But this is Adam and Eve in the garden. And then the next scene we see is Adam and Eve with their firstborn son, Cain. And then we see a depiction of Satan, which most likely is descriptive of the fall. And then we see things spiral, and we see the killing of Abel by his brother Cain. You can see the blood flowing down from Abel there. And then we see what she describes as Cain going to the land of Nod, where he finds a wife after being shown mercy by God. In the sixth panel, she shows the story of Jacob's ladder. In the next panel, she moves to the New Testament, where she shows the baptism of Jesus and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. In the next one, the bottom left-hand corner of the quilt, she illustrates the crucifixion of Jesus, the sky turning dark. You can see the blood flowing from the side of Jesus in the center there. The next one, she kind of works backwards and shows us Judas and the 30 pieces of silver for which he betrayed Jesus. In the next panel, she depicts the Last Supper. She says that it's Judas that's shown in a different hue because he was, quote, an off-color character. And then in the last panel, she depicts the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus as a child, along with the Star of Bethlehem. And then you can see the whole quilt here. Go ahead and go to the next slide, and you see it all kind of put together there. We don't know for sure her motivation in fashioning this quilt. I would like to think it had something to do with telling the story of the Bible. It would come as no surprise to me if her love for the scriptures led her to use her art to pass on truth to the next generation. I can imagine the inquiries from her own children as she's at night by the light of the fire, weaving together these stories and crafting each panel. And how beautiful it must have been to hear Harriet declare the truths found in these stories to her own children. Why did she pick these different stories? What stood out to her? And hearing her passion as she shares these and passes on truth from generation to generation. Later in 1898, Harriet Powers would complete the only other surviving quilt that we know of, what has come to be known as the pictorial quilt. And here is a picture of that one. What happened here is after seeing the Bible quilt on display for a number of years, faculty members of Atlanta University and their wives commissioned Miss Powers to make this quilt as a gift to the then president of the Union Theological Seminary, Dr. Charles Cuthbert Hall. And so this was given to him. As you can see, this quilt is also very vivid and intricate in detail. Whether or not it was intentional, many historians see a West African influence in her works and beautifully displaying and preserving for generations this beautiful style of art. There's something interesting about this quilt here, and I won't discuss each panel for sake of time, but it weaves together both history and Bible stories together. It's got Bible stories like Job praying for his enemies, Moses raising the serpent in the wilderness, Jonah and the great fish, along with some of the previous ones from the Bible quilt. But there's also historical scenes that she weaves in that had happened either shortly before her lifetime or during her lifetime. These moments like the dark day of May 19th, 1780, a meteor shower that happened in 1833, a winter storm from 1895, along with a few others. This quilt, which she made later on in life, seems to have a little bit more of an undertone of suffering, as she specifically includes different historical events that would have caused great hardship and also might have been seen by some people as judgment for the sins of slavery. It is clear that Harriet learned well how to see all of life through the lens of the biblical narrative, finding her own purpose and her own story in that larger story. And I love that her art is honest about the glory of creation, that all men and women were created in the image of God to spread his glory to the ends of the earth. She's honest about that, but she's also honest about original sin and the fall that entered the world. She was a woman personally acquainted with sorrow. She would have related with the suffering of Job and what it meant to pray for your enemies. She would have related to the weeping of the women at the cross over the death of a beloved one. She would have related to the need for redemption when everything seems to be saying that evil has the last word. This would have been her hope that she hung on to as she passed away in 1910 at the age of 72 years old. For Miss Powers, she would have been culturally rooted within the tradition of the black church, which was birthed out of necessity during the days of slavery and later Jim Crow. She would have been taught how to speak truth into every area of life using whatever gifts she had at her disposal. Her primary one being of weaving these fascinating scenes from the scriptures. She joins the larger black church in contributing to the even larger global church of Jesus by leading the way in creatively speaking truth into the culture through culturally relevant means in an excellent manner, while not being in any way beholden to the culture or dependent on it. There was no being bought by culture for her, but she was able to use culturally relevant means. There was no believing the lie that Christianity and its truths is simply a white man's religion, or maybe even a more subtle lie that can exist and live in our communities, that the proclamation of Christian truths must be delivered only in certain tones, with certain kinds of beats or certain melodies, or through certain palatable methods that make the broader Christian community most comfortable. This is a good reminder for us of the diversity of Christ's church and the various means and methods by which gospel proclamation can go forth. There's no one who can take away from the rich heritage of black men and women like Harriet Powers, who have been firmly committed to the good news of Jesus and the proclamation of his gospel and have found beautiful ways to communicate those truths. And by God's grace, may those voices not be silenced. Miss Powers' art has stood the test of time. We're talking about it years later, and it's done that for a variety of reasons. But one of the main reasons is it's really good art. It's not just Christians who have been fascinated with her works. I also found it interesting that the U.S. Postal Service stamps they picked were the historical events on the pictorial quilt instead of any of the Bible scenes, which is just an interesting tidbit. But it's just interesting to me that the quality of the art is beautiful. I mean, people were fascinated by it. But here's what, as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus that has given my life to, I'm all in on this. Like, all my cards are in that Jesus lived, died, buried, rose again. Amen. Like everything hinges on that. And so what's more amazing to me is that the quality of the art is simply an avenue for communicating something even more beautiful. That there is a Savior who is a friend of the sufferer. That there is one who has conquered evil by giving up his own life. And everyone needs to hear that message, the message of redemption, that evil does not have the last word, that Jesus wins. And because of the cross and resurrection, suffering simply becomes a slave to God's greater purposes, working for us and in us a weight of glory beyond compare. As I've had the privilege of reflecting on Miss Harriet Powers' life these last few months, there are 3 quick lessons about art I'd like for us to consider as we close out this session. First of all is this: art is education. With her quilt making, Harriet taught others and educated them, both explicitly in these biblical narratives, but also implicitly in areas that they had previously been ignorant. You can see this, and I don't have time to go into all of it, but the white woman, Jenny Smith, who wrote and bought this quilt, it's pretty fascinating. One of the interesting things to me is that Jenny Smith first saw the Bible quilt separate from its owner. So there was no preconceived ideas. You know how it is when someone says, hey, this really great artist everybody likes, he wrote a song, and you're listening, you're like, this isn't good. Like, but I'm supposed to say it's good because, this certain artist made it, right? But here, and you might do the same thing with it being bad. Like, no, like that's got to be bad because that artist, I don't like them. Here, there were no preconceived ideas or notions about the quality of the art. It was able to stand on its own, and in so doing, it served to educate Miss Jenny Smith and brought in her expectations of where good art can come from. We don't know how much she listened, but even in her own writing, she shows some of her previous ignorance and how surprised she was that Harriet was the maker of the quilt. It's actually a little bit funny. Speaking of men and women like Harriet, this is what she has to say. The Africans as a race are not an artistic people. You can laugh, it's okay. Yeah, it's just funny. It's ironic. She goes on to say, I don't recall any artist but one that has a darker hue of complexion. It's also ironic to me that she doesn't think the problem might be that they are enslaved, don't have access to the same materials and wealth and free time that white women have quilting while people are out in the fields, but that's ironic. Another thing that's ironic to me is she doesn't think the problem might be, an expansion of her friend group and cultural experiences. She kind of centers her own viewpoint as the unbiased reality. But we still have white people doing that today. So if I haven't seen it, it must not exist, right? So, maybe not much has changed. I don't know. But on that note, and here's my point. Even today, art can serve as a beautiful medium to communicate and educate and inform in ways that might not be possible through other means. So make good art that educates. Miss Powers stands for us as an example in that regard. Art is education. Secondly, art is resistance. Whether Harriet knew it or not, by weaving the quilts that she did, she was an active resistor against the evils of slavery, prejudice, and racism in the world. When you dehumanize people, it's a lot harder to do that when they're producing good art. By creating good art, she's resisting that dehumanization. Like the slaves who taught themselves how to read and wrote beautiful pieces explaining the plight of their fellow man. Like the Negro spiritual sung in the fields to remind that deliverance was coming and you can't take away our joy. You don't have that much control over me. Like Paul and Silas in prison singing hymns to God. Harriet creates and forms beauty that proclaims truth, resisting the lies of the day. She is doing as in a culture that said certain people were not actually created in God's image. She begins to image her creator, who formed order from chaos, who created humans from dust, who brought something from nothing, who made beauty from ashes. And as she takes scraps of cloth that make no sense and that just lay on a floor in a scattered pattern, with it, she tells a story that becomes not much different than her own life. What was broken and confusing has now become a glorious story of healing and wholeness. Art is resistance. And this leads us to our last and most important lesson about art. Art is proclamation. We go back to the Bible quilt. And I think one of the most important lessons we learn from Miss Harriet Powers' life is that the gospel can and should be proclaimed using any means at our disposal. With her patchwork quilt, she tells the most beautiful redemption story ever. The story that God created man and woman to spread his glory to all peoples. But sin enters the world as the deceiver tempts Adam and Eve, and the curse takes over humanity, and you see the brokenness. It's clearly revealed in the killing of Abel by his brother, as I mentioned earlier. It's the far left panel. You see his blood flowing down. Some people have wondered why it seems to go in chronological order till you get to the crucifixion, then it works backwards. We don't know for sure. We can't say her motivations, but art's meant to be pondered on, so what I like to do is say, hey, I wonder if this blood trickling down from the blood of Abel is meant to point us to the crucifixion, the panel at the bottom left where the sacrifice of Christ is clearly portrayed as the blood flows from his side. Between the bookends of the death of Christ on the left and the birth of Christ on the right, you see betrayal shown. You see two panels showing us Judas. It reminds me that no power of hell or no scheme of man can stop the plans of the sovereign King of the universe. Harriet would have intimately known what it was like for blood to cry out from the ground for justice, just like Abel's had after he was slain. But she also knew that Abel's blood that cried out, that cry that from the ground was ultimately answered in the God-man Jesus, who entered into our broken world and was also slain by his brothers. And he came to deal with injustice by shedding his own blood. Abel, though he is dead, still speaks through this work of art. And so too does Miss Powers, reminding us of one who did not stay dead, whose sacrifice was not in vain. And here's the thing, you can create good art all day. You can tell really cool stories. But if we don't have someone who can actually turn death into life, it's kind of useless. If there wasn't someone who can take the worst injustices and somehow turn them to something beautiful, it's hopeless. But Miss Powers believed that it was not in vain. Her work was not in vain because Jesus did not stay dead. And the empty tomb proclaims a hope that Miss Powers clung to in the darkest of nights, that death is defeated, Jesus is alive, suffering does not have the last word, and evil does not win. This is the good news that she was proclaiming. Jesus began this work in his life, death, burial, and resurrection, and he will consummate and complete that work when he returns to make all things new. There will be a day coming when a people from every nation, tribe, and tongue will be gathered around the throne. And what I love is that the beauty of the nations, we're told in Revelation, will be brought into that eternal kingdom. You might see this quilt hanging up somewhere. You'll see quilts that have never been seen because they were buried in the ashes of history. But this is what God does. All sin and injustice will be cast outside the kingdom of God, never more to return. Both the sin that's done to us and the sin that's in our own hearts. All suffering will be turned to glory. All tears will be wiped away. There will be no more mourning or crying, for the former things have passed. And Miss Powers' quilts serve as a tangible picture of what God does. I've seen it. Like I said, I'm all in on this. He takes scraps and misfits and broken pieces, and somehow, I don't understand it, but he weaves it all together, that when you zoom out and look at it, you see something glorious and beyond compare. And this is the hope that roots us. It's the same one that stood the test of time for Miss Powers. And so may we, inspired by the fascinating and wonderful Harriet Powers, remember to, I'm going to give my version of the quote since it's not a real quote anyways, preach the gospel at all times, by all means available and by any means necessary. Tell good stories. Build good spreadsheets for you engineers in here. Design good architecture. Make good music. Create good art for the good of the world and the glory of God. Amen.